Okay, cool. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. I think 30 is a pretty good number to get going on. I think it's definitely the biggest event EA-UCT has ever had, so that's pretty cool. But if some other people come along the way, they'll just join in a bit later. So just quickly to introduce myself, I'm Leo Karamanov. I'm Claude Formanek, and we are committee members at Effective Altruism UCT, and the organization putting on this event. And because we've advertised this quite far and wide across different channels, I just thought it'd be useful just to give a little bit of background super quick. So Effective Altruism is a global movement that is looking at employing some of the most effective solutions to the world's biggest problems. And the chapter at UCT is a small group that's trying to live out those ideals here, and we host talks and discussions on important issues. And one of the important issues identified by Effective Altruism is the development of safe artificial intelligence. And we think this is a really important issue that more people should be thinking and know about, and that's why we're super excited to have brought this panel together to discuss this issue.
Yeah, so broadly speaking, our topic is about AI safety and AI alignment. And then even more specifically, we want to start talking about AI safety in the context of Africa and what AI will mean, like emerging AI technology will mean for Africa. Like Leo said, we've advertised this quite broadly, so I think we have an audience that is like composed of people with different interests. So the first part of our discussion, we're going to be focusing on AI safety and alignment insofar as like artificial general intelligence, the kind of AI systems that might emerge in the near or nearish future, and how those systems possibly pose an existential risk to humanity. Then after that, we kind of want to focus in on more sort of the narrow definition of AI or narrow AI, which are the kind of systems we already see nowadays in the form of like recommender systems or self-driving cars and all the technologies that are made possible through that. And we want to then investigate or unpack how these technologies already pose big challenges for Africa and the development in Africa. So those are the two topics we hope to cover. And now I think we'll just lead on to introducing our panelists.
Yeah, cool. I just want to give a quick, so I think everyone is already doing this, but just a quick couple rules. Everyone already seems to be muted, which is great. We ask that you stay muted for the duration of the discussion panel, which will take us to around the hour mark, after which we will have an audience Q&A, and then at that point, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question verbally. You can also use the chat feature in Zoom. Some people have already posted some hellos and stuff there. You can definitely post questions as you think of them as they come up in discussion in that chat section. We will monitor that, and if there's something that's super interesting and pertinent to the conversation, we'll try and put it in. But otherwise, if your question doesn't get answered, you can save it to the end, and we will try and get to it then. Cool, but so without further ado, let's get going and have all the panelists just introduce themselves, tell us who they are and what they do. Tyna Eloundou, would you like to kick us off and then pass on to the next person?
Absolutely, I'd love to. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Tyna Eloundou, and I'm a policy researcher at OpenAI. My work there centers around finding ways to reduce risk of advanced AI from a systemic perspective. Models that are released in the AI world and the systems in which they're deployed within affect the world. And our job is to think about the impacts, implications, and research what could be some potential mitigations. powerful and potentially transformative technologies ought to be studied under all sorts of lenses, including economic, societal, and ethical, which is why I'm interested in AI safety. I'm doing research at OpenAI because the organization continually emphasizes the development of capabilities and safety in lockstep. I'm really excited to be here today and to share some ideas and thoughts with you. Thank you. I'd like to pass on the mic to Arnu.
Thanks, Tyna. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Arnu Pretorius. I'm an AI research scientist at InstaDeep. InstaDeep is a startup company working on building like decision-making AI systems that have strong roots in Africa. Yeah, and I work on the research team based in Cape Town, and we focus on multi-agent reinforcement learning research. Yeah, so there's some reasons why we think multi-agent RL is quite a powerful technology. One in particular is this thing called the autocurriculum hypothesis, where there's this sense of agents working together kind of have this generation of a curriculum where they have to adapt to each other's strategies, and this makes for sort of powerful systems that can emerge. But obviously, if you have this ability, you also need to make sure that it's safe and interpretable. And so there's an incentive to focus on things like safety. And I also have a history with EA a bit. During my PhD, I followed the community quite a bit and got involved in some things and read the 80,000 hours book that's closely aligned with their things on how to choose a good career. So, very happy to be here and excited to be on the panel. Yeah, maybe I can pass to Pelonomi.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, EAUCT, for having me and for having this chat with some of the really cool panelists. So my name is Pelonomi, and I work at Nedbank as a data scientist and use case lead within an advanced analytics team. And we're responsible for developing and deploying models within the bank that serve different areas of the bank. I've currently wedged myself into the fraud side of things because it aligns better with my ethics. And apart from that, I spend my spare time advocating for responsible AI, I guess. Within my team at work, we're working closely with our model risk management I suppose, chapter or department in order to set up regulatory and developmental processes within the bank in terms of AI. And then outside of that, yeah, I'm a minority, female, non-white person, so this stuff affects me and the people I care about. Yeah, and I pass it on to Tommie.
Thank you, Pelonomi. So yeah, I'm Tommie Meyer. I'm a professor in computer science at UCT. So the work that I do is in AI. So I'm an AI researcher. I work in an area that's known as knowledge representation and reasoning, but you can also think of it as logic-based AI research. I also wear a different hat. I'm the co-director of the National Center for AI Research. So this is a center that spans a number of universities across South Africa. We certainly don't do all the research, or we don't cover all the AI research that's being done in the country. But I think we have a fairly big footprint in that sense. So regarding EA, I've always been well, not always, but certainly for the past couple of years, I've been a great admirer of the Effective Altruism Society. So I was very happy when they asked me to be on the panel. I think they do excellent work in many different areas. But as to my relation to say AI and safety and that kind of thing, so the work that I do is not directly related to that. But I feel, and I strongly feel that from an AI researcher perspective, it's important to look at the consequences of some of the work that you are involved in, even if it's just peripherally involved in that. So, there's an old joke that philosophy is too important to be left to the philosophers. And so I have some philosophy colleagues, and they always roll their eyes when they hear this. But I think the same holds for AI research as well, especially these days. I think AI is too important to be left just to the AI researchers. And therefore, I'm especially glad to see that someone like Tyna is here, who's looking at the policy side as well. So as you'll see when we continue with the panel discussion, I think it's really important not just to, you can easily get lost and lose the forest for the trees if you're an AI researcher. So it's important to have people that have the expertise, that know what's going on within AI, that they take the broader view as well. Okay, so thanks.
Cool. Thanks very much. I think if nothing else, we have to say that we have a pretty great collection of panelists here. So we are super happy and thankful that they've all taken the time to be here today. So let's kick things off just by circling back to the sort of division that Claude laid out at the start of this evening's talk between sort of two types of artificial intelligence. The one is one that we might think of as something more long-term, sort of further away in the future, and we could call that artificial general intelligence. And to separate that from more narrow artificial intelligences, which we might say already exist, the sorts of things like recommendation engines, or self-driving car technology, those sorts of things. And to try and separate those, because we'd also like our discussion in two parts to sort of look at those two types of AI separately. And so since you're a university professor, Tommie, I think we're going to kick that one to you to lead us off and try help us understand this distinction.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And of course, I'm going to give some opinions here, and I'll be very happy to of course, hear what the other panelists have to say about this, because within the AI research community, there are many different views about many of these aspects that we're going to talk about, even something like AGI. So let me tell you what I think about artificial general intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. So I want to start off by first telling you what AGI is not. And there, since we're talking to a broad audience here, for those of you who work in AI, my apologies, I might be preaching to the converted. But when I say I want to talk about what AI or AGI is not, I mean the type of thing that you would frequently see either in a media article or in a movie. This idea that probably the two stereotypes would be, the first one would be the kind of Terminator-like scenario, where there's a robot uprising. We build the robots and somehow they decide that this is not what they want and they take over the world, something along those lines. Or an AI that suddenly becomes conscious, and kind of determines their own goals in terms of that, and then usually, there's havoc after that. So I would say that when we talk about AI, whether it's narrow AI or artificial general intelligence, the whole idea of consciousness is orthogonal to this. It seems it's possible to be conscious and not intelligent. Well, all four possibilities there. You have all four possibilities. So really, you should think of consciousness as being orthogonal to intelligence. So having told you what I think AI in general, including AGI, is not, let me then go into a bit more detail about, I think, what many people mean when they talk about artificial general intelligence. So the idea is simply that if you look at what we have as AI systems at the moment, some of these systems are very, very good at what they do, but they are very narrow in terms of the domain on which they focus. So for example, you can have a very good Go player, an AI system that's a very good Go player, or an AI system that's very good at image recognition, but that's its domain. Or you can have something that's very good as let's say, a chess player. But it's a very specific narrow domain. When we talk about AGI, the idea is that it's more the way in which we as humans do things. And I'm not saying by that that machines should aspire to be, or to reason the way in which humans do, because humans have lots of biases. And there are lots of drawbacks in terms of the way in which humans employ intelligence. But the idea is that we as humans have a version of common sense that can be applied across a broad range of domains. In fact, almost any type of domain that you can come up with. And we're general problem solvers in that sense. And it seems that when it comes to AI, we're not really close to that at the moment yet, but that is what general AGI seems to be. The idea that you can solve problems across a wide variety of domains. Just a little bit of history, and then I'll stop talking about this. In the early days of AI, it seemed to many of the AI researchers that building common sense into AI systems are going to be very easy. And ironically, that's turned out to be one of the hardest things to do. So something that a typical 5-year-old or a 6-year-old could do. It's frequently very, very hard for AI systems because it seems that it's very hard to build this idea of common sense and a very general way of looking at the world into systems. Whereas on the other hand, you've got more narrow systems. The last thing I want to say about all of this is that I'm a little bit hesitant to draw a distinction between AGI and AI, in the sense of the one being across a whole bunch of domains, and the other one, AI, being focused on a very specific domain. The reason I'm hesitant to draw a distinction between these two is because it's really a continuum. You have a spectrum with very general problem-solving abilities on the one side, and on the one hand, and then on the other side of the spectrum, or on the other hand, you have systems that are very narrow. So I think it's much better to look at them in terms of AI and safety and AI and its use in Africa as well, as more of a spectrum than as two separate issues. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Arnu, did you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe I can. I don't know if anyone else has any comments.
No.
Okay, maybe I'll shoot also. So I completely agree with Tommie. I think there's this idea of sort of the generality across number of maybe scenarios or tasks that you can handle from perspective of doing well in them, and also then the narrow thing of doing well in a specific task. But I wanted to just comment because there's actually an interesting paper that Francois Cholet, I think I'm saying it right, I hope, who's the inventor of Keras. For those who might not know, Keras is a very popular package or framework that's used for deep learning. And he wrote this very interesting paper called On the Measure of Intelligence. And there, they talk about various definitions of, intelligence and what people have, talked about over many, many years. And then it boils down to something that he calls skill acquisition efficiency. That's kind of what he says is sort of intelligence across a broad range of sort of domains. And, to unpack that a bit is the idea of if you're given some task from any randomly selected domain, how efficient are you at acquiring the skills necessary to solve the task? And what's interesting in this, typically now AI systems, we build them with structural priors or some domain knowledge, but that has kind of fell to the wayside a bit. And now there's this idea of a lot of data is the way to go, and we just bigger models, more data. But in the paper, he argues in sort of a clever way that priors and data buy you skill. It's not intelligence. It's and to give you an example, think of an IQ test. So an IQ test is supposed to test how intelligent are you. Let's say before taking an IQ test, you study what IQ tests are about or how they're set up. You don't do IQ tests, you just study what they're about. It might be that this prior knowledge to taking the IQ test actually masks how intelligent you are if you're measured through the IQ test. The same with doing lots of IQ tests before you take the IQ test that's supposed to say how intelligent you are. And in some sense, this is what systems today are given. We're sort of saying, hey, here's the task you should do, and here is lots of data or if you go the other route, prior knowledge, but it's sort of giving task skill acquisition efficiency along one specific task, and buying that skill through data or priors. And what Francois is saying in his paper is that he says that is definitely not the way that we should be measuring intelligence. We should be thinking more along like acquisition efficiency across a broad range of tasks. And yeah, I definitely recommend anyone who's sort of interested in these things. It's a very nice paper.
So yeah, I think that was a wonderful explanation of this continuum of artificial intelligence. But now to people in the audience, it might not immediately be clear why developing artificial general intelligence or ever more powerful general intelligence could pose a risk, and like why we're here seemingly like wanting to talk about AI safety. So I think it might be nice if maybe one of our panelists could outline for us like the risks that are like uniquely posed by artificial general intelligence. And in this case, I think I'll pass it to Pelonomi to maybe take it away.
Yeah, sure. And any of the other panelists must feel free to jump in at any time in case my arguments are not in line with yours. It's likely that they're not. So I think in terms of AGI, one of the ways that people like to think of it is in terms of attaining human level of intelligence, right? So we're kind of using human intelligence as a benchmark as to what we are trying to achieve with our machines. And I liked Tommie's encapsulation where he talks about common sense and us getting computers to a point of common sense that they're able to then, as Arnu was mentioning with Francois' paper, they're able to acquire skills depending on what they feel is right. So I think the first reason why this is a little bit scary is because in order to be able to decide what skills are necessary to acquire without someone instructing you what skills should be acquired, it means that there is a certain level of will or autonomy by this machine, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be like a Robocop or a robot Armageddon where they decide to get rid of the human race, but it does mean that the robot or machine is making decisions for itself. And those decisions may not serve everybody equally, which is one of the scary points. The other part, though, is that our definition of humanity that we're trying to build machines up off of comes from different places, right? So I think it's quite a privileged position to imagine that a machine that is made within your image is a machine that is able to cater to your needs and to cater to your lived experience. But when we are looking at definitions of humanity that we then want to mimic within our machines, we generally have a particular kind of human that we have in mind. And the way things are running now, that human is based off of the status quo, right? So it'll be a human or a machine that's capitalist in nature, right? Because that's what's driving the world at the moment. It's likely to be inspired by Western ethics, which help to drive individualism. So the machine as an individual is likely to be more important than how that machine interacts with the community or the world as a whole. And that machine is also likely to have its foundations based on scientific principles of rationality, right? And that means that that machine supposedly would be objective and rational. And all of those three things mean that we are having a definition of human that doesn't necessarily apply to all cultures and to all people and to all modus operandi that exists in the world, which means it can be dangerous for more people than it is for others.
Cool. So I want to check, kind of if all panelists agree, if there are further concerns, please elaborate.
Sure. Personally, I believe that any technology developed without a lot of forethought poses some degree of risk, right? Which is why I really like the characterization of AI and AGI as being on a spectrum, because if you've examined the events that have unfolded over the last several years, you'll see that even with the narrow AI systems that we have today, right, we've run into significant problems. So I think there's already a good amount of work to be done to make sure that we understand and can safeguard today's narrow systems and get practice at mitigating their harms, or maybe eliminating them if possible, before tomorrow's AGI arrives, right? I think we don't have a strong school of thought yet there. And I think that's the point of a forum like this, where, right, to have an opportunity to discuss these things and push on research in those domains. So essentially, the more powerful a technology, the greater the risk, in my opinion. You can jump in if you disagree. It just so happens that AGI, as we currently conceive it, as Tommie explained it, could be the most powerful system that we ever design. And I think something crucial that Pelonomi mentioned was that the AGI, to some degree, has to bridge a gap between the instructions that we give it, or the goals that we give it, and how it interprets it and translates them into actions. And that mode of interpretation depends on something, right? Something in the world. The way you interpret things depends on your past experience. If you've ever met a toddler, you've run into excessive literalism, right? You ask him to put maybe peanut butter on toast and he could put the whole jar on the bread, not understanding that you really mean open the jar, etc. So similarly, we have legal systems all over the world that design laws that have loopholes and unintended gaps, because the verbiage or the language sometimes can lead to unintended consequences that cannot be foreseen by the people who are writing the laws, perhaps because they have a different point of view and have a different standing in society. And so we as a species, right, as humans, as people, have not yet figured out a way to convey the intentions behind our instructions to machines. There's still that gap that exists. At OpenAI, we have several researchers that are dedicated to trying to figure out how to solve this problem. How do you design systems that will understand, rather than just the literal instructions that you give it, but the meaning behind what you say, and are motivated to follow that meaning? And that involves not just having machines that understand the meaning, but are able to understand different meaning based on different moral codes.
If I could jump in here quickly. So I wholeheartedly agree with, in fact, with what both Pelonomi and Tyna was saying just now. Maybe I can phrase this in a slightly different way. It seems to me that at the moment, with narrow AI, we're in a position where machines are too stupid to really understand what we frequently tell them, which in many ways is a good thing, because if things don't quite work out the way we intended, we can shut them down. But it may well be that when we get closer and closer to AGI, there will come a time when we will be too stupid to tell machines what we really want, and they will take us at our word, but there might be unintended consequences there, and then it's not going to be the fault of the system that has a problem. The system will interpret to a fault, or to a T what you're saying, and we may come at a point where there's no going back once we're past that particular point. So again, it's this question of a continuum, and when we reach that kind of point.
And if I may add, I mean, when we think about AGI or even narrow AI, what we aspire to achieve is a machine that's even better than your average human in terms of its decision-making ability. Because any random on the street has their own internal biases that help inform the decisions that they make. And we as humans are expecting a machine to perform even better than us. but we have to teach it to be better than us. It's kind of a difficult conundrum, deciding what that is.
Yeah, I think maybe also just to comment here, definitely agree on all the points. For me, I mean, even if there was something like a shared value or ethic or moral system that everyone was happy with, and we didn't have, you know, differences in opinion on that, it's still like a precision problem. Like you know, Tommie said, it's you know, it's difficult to really specify exactly. I mean, the example of peanut butter was perfect. Like, there's too many knobs, let's say, you will, to really get it right. And I think what we have as at our advantage is, like, over, you know, many years, let's say, like, you know, evolution and everything, we have this, you know, shared theory of mind, and there's some sense of interpretability and shared experience of, you know, being able to infer what the other person wants, or how you can, you know, be of service or interact with them. And machines don't have that. There's this complete blank slate, and we have to kind of, you know, program that in, or have some learning algorithm, but the learning algorithm needs some objective to solve. And yeah, if we don't get that right, then, you know, it's not going to do what we want it to do. But I think the other thing that's interesting is, I mean, often in these conversations, it's mentioned that, you know, human level intelligence versus narrow intelligence or something. But there are many arguments that, you know, at the very point where you reach human level intelligence, you will immediately have superhuman level intelligence, because you would have a system that is, you know, as intelligent as a human, but by its design will have, you know, almost limitless memory or limitless computation, or it would just have access to the internet, or all these things. So that, like Tommie said, the spectrum, there's really a sort of takeoff point at some stage, where if you build a system that's powerful enough, just by its design not being almost like biologically constrained like we are, it'll immediately just self-improve and sort of be able to take off. And that's one of the risks that people often talk about, is that there might be a point where if you make a mistake, or you've done it wrong, you set up the conditions incorrectly, you only get to test that once, because if you let the system you know, go from that point on, you will essentially lose control of it. So yeah.
And I think to that point, Arnu, when you do have a system that makes a mistake, it's making a mistake at scale. Like, a person can only make so many decisions about so many people, but as soon as it's a computer doing it, they can just spread it way faster and way further than any person possibly could.
So I was always on board, but I hope that the rest of the audience is also now somewhat convinced that this is an issue worth thinking about, worth worrying about. But we're also not here to just scare people and add another thing on their list of world issues to be stressed about. So I was thinking we could maybe talk a little bit about at a practical level, if we agree that this is a potentially very tricky, dangerous area to be working in, how we should regulate development around AI, maybe at the political level. And Tyna, since you work in the policy side of things, maybe you can kick us off, and we can see what the other panelists have to say after that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thinking about regulation is tricky in this space. It's a conversation that must be had, and one that OpenAI as an organization and individual researchers, we all believe should involve people, both citizens, policymakers, and governments. We're all stakeholders in this, and we have a drive to make sure that the technology as it develops on a global scale will serve all of us equally. So I think thinking about the framework of regulation and the purpose it serves can be helpful here, because the governance systems that we've developed over the years are really there to make sure that whatever is relevant, whatever issues are relevant to their citizenry, to their constituency, is dealt with, right? Whether it's via regulation, drafting of laws, distribution of benefits or resources, or penalties. And so when we're developing a technology that has impact on a local, global, and yeah, on a local and global scale, I think there should be governance systems locally and globally. Coordination problems are bound to arise, but there is some hope. A partnership on AI has partnered with some of the leaders in AI development technology, but I don't think that's enough, right? The members of that partnership have committed to not racing, which is a condition that can make AI development excessively risky. But I think that they also have to work with policymakers who have strong experience and expertise in developing policies for their constituencies. There might be conflicts to resolve, figuring out what to prioritize. And I think these are conversations that must be had now. And we'd love to be a part of it at OpenAI. I think it's exciting for a private company to think about the prospect of potentially developing something so transformative, but it's not within their mandate to be able to do so and at the same time regulate themselves in a way that is adequate for society at large. So I think that we should continually have conversations about how to think about the societal impact. And it's our task for all of us to harness the enormous benefits and mitigate the harms. And that goes beyond the decision makers in these private companies alone.
If I could jump in here as well. I think one of the most important kind of core aspects to develop here is the notion of AI literacy among policy makers and people who would be involved in this. So by AI literacy, I don't mean knowing or dealing with building a specific AI system. I mean, these days it's becoming easier and easier for someone who doesn't necessarily have a PhD in computer science to actually build AI systems. But that's not what I'm talking about. I mean basic literacy amongst those who make decisions to understand what AI is really about. So I'll probably mention this a little bit later in the discussion as well. In my view, this could already start at school, but certainly at university level, courses that teach basic AI literacy so that when policymakers get together, they understand what is being dealt with when they're talking about AI specifically.
And if I may, I think at this stage in the process, and maybe someone correct me if I'm wrong, but we only really have 2 countries in the world that have developed official proposals for AI regulation frameworks. I think it's the EU Commission, and I think China 2 weeks ago has also released something. But I think what is also quite powerful about policy, and we saw it with GDPR, which was the European privacy laws, where what they could do with a policy like that, or I don't even know if the policy, I don't know what the correct terminology is for it, but with that, they're able to enforce countries that interact within that country, with that country to follow the same kinds of regulations. So with GDPR, if you were a country interacting with parts of the EU, you still had to follow their regulation frameworks. And I think that can also be quite a powerful way to ensure that there's like a global compliance and global cooperation in terms of developing and driving forth AI stuff.
If I may add something, I think another important component for policymaking or regulation is opacity, right? You have governments have to put in place mechanisms that ensure or enforce truthful revelation, right? So companies have to report honestly or get audited or have some mechanism for policymakers to probe, right, and make sure that the laws are being followed. And I think in AI in particular, we have an opacity problem in the sense that a lot of we have an opacity problem at that grand scale, right? Like the companies, it's difficult to bridge that gap when there's lack of understanding, as Tommie mentioned, and companies are just developing new products and deploying them at breakneck pace. But beyond that, even within the models, I think the field of explainability is still evolving. And there's so many things we don't know about how our models behave or why they choose certain action over others, which could have huge ramifications, or what is the real difference between neural network V1 versus neural network V2? Could it potentially have some sort of long tail risk that occurs under very specific conditions that are hugely disastrous? We don't know. So I think that developing that explainability muscle a little bit more so that policy can also be more effective is something we must do for effective regulation to take place.
And adding on to that, keep adding, I think in terms of opacity, it's not just with the model itself and it being a black box that we don't quite understand, but also opacity in terms of the stuff around the model. So being transparent about the accountability structure, and also being transparent about like rollback procedures and things like that, that governs how the model behaves in the real world, and us having mechanisms to make sure that there is a plan for when something goes wrong when we haven't predicted it.
Yeah, that was a fantastic discussion. And we're now kind of thinking, maybe let's focus now on this idea that suppose in the short term, or the medium term, we effectively manage the risk, the existential risk posed by like super artificial general intelligence. Nonetheless, like these narrow AIs will become increasingly powerful and capable of amazing things and unlock like new levels of productivity in the world and the economy. Some might argue that it'll be more impactful than like the Industrial Revolution was in terms of potentially creating like prosperity or at least wealth in the world. So we have obviously concerns about how that wealth created or will be like shared or distributed across the world, because obviously we have like the breakneck pace research happening in like very specific places, like in China, the US, and other like very developed countries. So how likely are we to see these benefits get distributed to Africa in particular? Like, how do we ensure that we benefit here as well from that technology? So there's a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, like it would be nice if the panelists could tell us if they think that we're in for a world of prosperity and wealth and thanks to AI technology, or if they disagree, and then unpack how we make sure that Africa can benefit as well. So maybe Tommie, would you like to start with that?
I can start. So in one sense, this is an easy question, but in another sense, it's a very difficult one. I think AI, like many technologies, it's a double-edged sword. And I think as Tyna was referring to a little earlier as well, with any kind of technology, there are going to be possible advantages and disadvantages. So the optimistic view of this is that this could be fantastic for humankind in general. We could automate all the drudgery, all the work that no one wants to do, leave that to machines, and we can live a happy life. Or of course, it can be completely terrible in the sense that a small number of people could reap all the benefits and could leave the rest of the world behind in that sense. in that sense, this is the easy part. And of course there can be something in between as well. It just, I think, comes back to the point that I mentioned right at the beginning, that AI research is too important to be left to AI researchers. I really think it is possible in the next 10 to 15 years that this can have a major influence on human society in general. The Industrial Revolution had a great effect, initially terrible on many people, but overall it seems it's had a wonderful effect on humankind. And similarly, before that, the Agricultural Revolution, long before that, initially it was terrible, but it turned out to be something wonderful after that as well. The main issue, I think, is this question of what we make of it. So it's perfectly possible to create or to ensure that automation is used in such a way that everyone can benefit from it. But the question is, how do we do that? And I'm afraid that AI researchers do not have the answer to that. And that's why I think so I know I'm throwing the ball into other people's court here, but it's a political question. And I want to bring this back to the question of AI literacy again. Those who make decisions can only make it if they know what AI is about and the direction that AI probably will take us in. So that's in a nutshell what I think about this.
Maybe I can also just comment. So I like this guy called Hans Rosling. I don't know if anyone knows him. He's sort of like the stats guy, and he always has these like very, he passed away a few years ago, but he has, these amazing positive views on development in the world. And he talks about how like across the world, like, we've almost lifted, I think, 1 billion people out of poverty over a very short period of time. And I think a lot of that has to do with obviously tech advancements and things, and driving the cost down of things that make well-being possible for many people around the world. And like when it comes to things like inequality or the distribution of wealth, what's interesting is like if you look at the data, it seems that actually globally, like equality has actually been going down. But if you look at developed worlds, equality has increased. The developed world, not developing, developed world. And that's interesting because you can almost think of like for example, Tesla. Like Tesla has it's manufacturing cars that can drive themselves, and who's benefiting from this? Who's benefiting? The investors in Tesla, the engineers who like work at Tesla, basically like a minority few who have maybe high skills to get the jobs to work at Tesla, or they're already in privileged position to be investors in Tesla. Tesla then deploys what they develop first within their developed country, right? So then maybe there's self-driving trucks and things, and now people who are truck drivers potentially lose their jobs, and so it's almost like this local sort of pushing away of the haves and the haves not, based on like the distribution of power from what is being developed through technology. And whether that will, I think, spread across almost like on a global scale, I'm not sure yet, but it seems to be happening, at least in the developed world now, that you can see this almost like redistribution of the pie, and it not being definitely not being sort of like not everyone's pie is growing. It's just a select few who are getting more out of this. And now already this is pushing to something like maybe we should have universal basic income or these type of things being implemented for anyone who could be suffering from maybe like being in a position of losing their job. And it's interesting to think maybe if these things will be implemented before technology really pushes the inequality level to an extreme in most countries who are able to develop it. Yeah. So.
So we thought maybe it would be, maybe somebody could just touch on that last point I mentioned earlier about like how concerned we should be that like the breakneck pace AI research seems to be like heavily concentrated in either like profit-seeking companies in the US, like Pelonomi touched on that, that seems to the outcome there almost always are these like profit maximizing AI systems. Or then we have systems coming from say like China, where the government is using the system for things like mass surveillance as an example. Like those forces that seem to be driving the development now. I don't know how to phrase the question, but I wonder if somebody has something to say about that.
I think.
Sorry,
go ahead.
That's left to me. I think I have very little optimism for everything being shared. And I suppose that is based on the current experience. I mean, just from an industry perspective, trying to find a job in machine learning that is not at a place that is trying to commodify a product or develop a product in order to make money is extremely difficult. For example, trying to find a job where it's data science for social good, you'll probably end up at an NGO that struggles to get funding, or one of these big world organizations that is trying to solve big problems in the world, but it's not a Google, it's not an Amazon, it's not a YouTube, it's not an Instagram, it's not a Facebook. All of the major tech companies that we have are generating money off of people. And that money is not being distributed. I mean, sending Bezos to space and his workers are struggling and like literally falling over dead in the workshops because they're working so hard and for so little. So yeah, I have very little hope that the resources monetary wise will be shared. And I think it's also something worth considering that inequality regarding money is a very serious thing, but there's also different types of inequality, right? So we're encroaching on a time where people's freedoms may be compromised, and therefore some people may be more free than others. In terms of owning people's information, some people's will be more private than others. And I think those are important things to consider when we consider how well everybody will be treated and how similar everybody will be treated. But I do have a lot of hope, because there is a lot of great things that AI and machine learning and data science can do for the world. And there are a whole lot of people who are trying to do good things. So yeah, I only have hopes, but I'm still quite pessimistic about whether capitalism isn't going to uncivilize us. Yeah.
I mean, there is some good, I think, coming from, I mean, I agree. I think I'm also fairly, I don't know how I feel about big tech sharing all their profits. Maybe taxation will come in and that kind of forces them to, but then lawyers will find loopholes or something, I don't know. But what I think is there's still quite a few benefits, and sometimes you wonder why big tech do these things. But for example, Google have big divisions that do social good projects. One that comes to mind is they have a flood prediction system that they developed and deployed in India and Bangladesh, and it's serving many people, giving them early warning for whether floods are coming. And I don't think they at all. It's not a product to make money off or anything like that. Maybe it's driving research in some sense in some of their models and things, but so there's some benefits, and I think like free apps, things like education being spread wide. If now you can, on your phone, like smartphones are widespread, and you can learn things for free, and that's driven largely by technology and tech companies and things. But yeah, so I guess it's not all bad, but I agree. I think it's just gonna be hard for Amazon to suddenly say, okay, well, we'll take a 50% cut, and we'll take the 50 that we're not sharing amongst our investors, and everyone is spreading them across for some like universal base income that we'll definitely desperately need at some point. And yeah, maybe that could be a utopia at some stage where people sort of wake up. You have, I mean, there's lots of research on kind of how much you need to be happy, and there's the whole thing of Maslow's triangle. So if you have satisfied up to a certain point, there's only what they call like self-actualization, which is you just worrying about like, what's the purpose of my life and these kind of things. But if you reach a certain level, like more money and things don't really translate to you being much happier. You have to find some other way, like a personal exploration, to find like what makes you happy, what drives you. So if the income is so massive from AI that's just generating unbelievable amounts of wealth, and everyone can be put on that level where it just plateaus after a certain amount of let's say income, then what's left with is everyone just trying to figure out what really drives them, what makes them happy, what should they do, and they don't have to worry about like putting food on the table and that sort of thing. And there's been periods of history where like a small subset of the population had that, right? I think in like Victorian times or something, there was like the elite that basically just didn't have to do anything. And then you get people who like spent their whole lives looking at bugs and making notebooks, and then they became really good scientists because they didn't really have anything else to do. So yeah, maybe that could be the future. But yeah, I don't know.
If I may add something quickly, there's a quote by Tim Cook that I like a lot, and it says that technology is capable of doing great things, but it doesn't want to do anything. It doesn't want to do anything at all. Or I think I paraphrased it. And I think what it communicates effectively is that technology really is a product of the environment it's developed in. So I have concerns about two things primarily. There's the development phase, and then there's the distribution phase. So the profit-seeking incentive is a very powerful one. It's a really powerful motive, and it can shape a lot of decisions about how you develop, design, and deploy. And I don't think, for something that we maybe here only, or maybe only a few of us agree, has great potential risk, I don't think that we should move fast and break things, right? I think we should proceed carefully here. So in the development phase, I think there currently, there's not enough understanding, as we talked about the opacity problem before, but I also think that there's not enough curbing of the really strong profit incentive. And B, in the distribution phase, right, I think it's true that the profits accrue to the few who develop the technology by and large, right? With that, they have the latitude to choose to redistribute the benefits, but it's really up to their discretion. I think to Pelonomi's point about companies that will work under a social good umbrella, but actually get you stuck doing irrelevant work. That was my concern as well. I think that's why I joined OpenAI, and there are a growing number of companies, I think, that are devoted to broadly distributing benefits. But OpenAI specifically has that in its charter. This commitment to use its influence to ensure the benefit of all, and to prevent itself from unduly concentrating power. And I think the way you do that is with cooperation with academic researchers of other fields, academic researchers in less prestigious institutions, policy institutions, and the global community.
Maybe one or two remarks from my side as well. So firstly, I want to link up with this, what Pelonomi was saying, specifically maybe in the South African context, that it's kind of hard to find an institution to work for that focuses solely on the good. So, you can always come and talk to UCT. It's possible to do some good there. I'm not saying everything that's being done at UCT is wonderful, but it's certainly possible to do so. And then I want to make an unrelated point, and this is more on kind of an optimistic note, but AI, well, AI technologies and AI techniques specifically. So if we compare AI tools and the way in which AI systems would make decisions to the way in which humans typically do, and we want to get a sense of fairness, because after all, if there are decisions to be made, we want these decisions to be fair. So humans are, as we know, frequently terrible, but they're terrible in two ways. Humans can be incredibly biased in making decisions, but their decisions can also be very noisy. And by noisy, I mean that if you take the judicial system, for example, you can have two judges who, if they have exactly the same case in front of them, will give completely different sentences, and they will be completely different outcomes. It's worse than that. You can have the same person who on a Monday makes a specific decision, and if you were to have asked them on a Wednesday, just before or after they've eaten, they'd make a completely different decision. So in that sense, the decisions are noisy. So one major advantage that AI systems have over there is that they're not noisy. They may be biased. And certainly, depending on the data that's being fed in there, they may be biased. But in some sense, in order to avoid that, we don't need to worry about systems being noisy, or at least to a much lesser extent. We can focus on trying to get the bias or to get lack of bias in there. And that seems to me to be one of the major advantages of using AI systems for making decisions.
I think to add to that, though, I mean, those biases are quite problematic, but I do think that ethics infringements, I guess, what do you want to call them, can be just as blurred. So, for example, a story that keeps coming to mind is how there was a whistleblower at YouTuber who exposed the algorithm for driving, the recommendation algorithm for driving extremism, because
so we unfortunately seem to have lost Pelonomi. Just give 1 sec.
This may be YouTube censoring us.
Yeah, he was about to reveal very, very sensitive information. Okay, that's very unfortunate. We'll keep an eye on the waiting room and see if she rejoins. In the meantime, Claude, I know you had one more question you wanted to ask.
Yeah. Okay, Leah, let's go ahead with this for now. Wait, let's just give it 20 seconds to maybe join.
There was going to be technical difficulties, but I think it's run pretty smoothly so far. And then once Pelonomi's back, I think we'll try and wrap up and leave a couple of minutes for some audience questions. So you can use this moment of silence to think about everything that's been discussed and think about what you'd like to ask the panelists.
All right. I'm going to go ahead sort of say our last bit. Oh, wait, here we go. Here's Pelonomi.
Apologies.
Hi.
AI is trying to silence me.
Yeah, that's literally what we said, yeah.
Okay, you should be back. Please try and say what you're trying to say about YouTube.
All right, okay, so one of the examples is YouTube's algorithm driving extremism inadvertently. So they didn't program it to, it just found that by optimizing for recommending extreme content, it was able to increase YouTube's revenue. And one person in the company realized that this is what's happening, and therefore they became a whistleblower and had to leave the company. But I do think that that kind of sentiment around a lot of the big tech and even in smaller product producing institutions, that the bottom line is the most important line. Whether it is generating income is the most important thing. And often that means that infringements on people's rights and people's autonomy and people's ownership of their lives and their data and their neurological or psychological state is second to that bottom line. Like there's some scary stories, like about I saw on Twitter the other day, Google was offering to take off the cognitive load of its users, and Facebook is looking, it has a development team that looks at neuro waves inside your brain in order to deduce text from it. And I think those kinds of things can be really scary because it kind of blurs the line between self-autonomy and influenced behavior via a particular technology. And if that is being done in order to make money, I think it can be very difficult to try and decide whether it's right or wrong and whose fault it is when it does happen. Because that behavior ultimately is coming from you when you are then exercising that behavior by choosing a particular thing to buy or choosing a particular service to opt into. But yeah, I have hope, but I'm not very optimistic.
All right. So our final kind of question is basically, I spoke to another student who I think is in the audience now, actually, a student from Nairobi in Kenya, and she's sort of doing a paper on AI policy stuff. And she told me about how China has been making like agreements with governments in Africa, basically agreements where the China will bring in like high-tech surveillance type stuff for the government, which the government couldn't get otherwise, like the African government certainly couldn't get otherwise, in exchange for the like data that they collect on the population in those countries. And then on the flip side, like I can think of Facebook, for example, making agreements with other African governments where they like make it free from a data perspective to access Facebook. And so in many developing countries, Facebook is synonymous with the internet because everyone experiences the internet through Facebook. And that's obviously like a massive opportunity for Facebook to gather a lot of data on these populations. And so I want to relate this to another quote that I think some people will be familiar with, but like people say that data is the new oil in the 21st century, and there's like this race for collecting data, and whoever has the data, that's where the money is, and stuff like that. And you know, with the oil race, big companies came into African states, made deals with governments, exploited, extracted, and very few people in those countries actually benefited, except for like the corrupt government, possibly. And so my fear when we were discussing, like thinking about this topic is, are we going to see something similar play out in Africa again? Like, is there going to be this race for the data on all the African users? And is it going to be just like an exploitation type thing? I don't know. I saw Pelonomi sort of nodding her head, so I'm hoping you might have something to say about this.
I came across, so there's this long-standing relationship between China and Africa, and how they are supporting certain developmental processes on the continent in order to, I don't know, they're investing, okay? And one of those stories is about them, I can't remember which country it is for the life of me, but they set up an entire conference center for like Parliament to do all of its political discussions, and it was very high tech. And I mean, you were talking about how that there was an agreement that all the data would then be shared with China. It was found out that the whole place was bugged and that they were extracting that data without consent. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's all I have to say for now, and I'll come back later.
Ruan just commented here. He says that he believes it was the funding of the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia.
There you go.
So I can quickly follow up on that. So you were talking about African countries in this case specifically, but I think this is the problem is a global one in the sense that the ordinary person on the street, and that includes many AI researchers, don't think through and don't understand what it means to give your data away. This idea of, well, who's going to be interested in my data? I'll quickly click on this and go ahead and do this because it's, what's the downside of this? That seems to me to be the major problem underlying this. And I think, again, it comes back to AI literacy. If people understand and if it becomes clear what the issues are, in other words, what the consequences are of doing that, and people realize that this is the case, then it's much easier to push back, regardless of in which country you are. It may be easier to push back in certain countries than in others. But if you have a situation in which people don't necessarily realize what the dangers are, then you've lost the battle already. So it's a matter of AI literacy. I really feel strongly about this. It's almost this is the part that needs to come first before you look at any other ways of mitigating or dealing with these issues.
If I may add something quickly, I think this is a really important question. I agree that data is really important, right? The new oil. And then you pair that with all these companies that have a really strong profit-seeking incentive, and you have them seeking scale in the first place. So they're seeking to get data from as many people as possible so they get, widespread adoption. And you have them also potentially and actively, in some cases, using the data for purposes that perhaps we would not approve of. In particular, there were incidents where Facebook was gathering data from people and running psychological experiments without consent, right? Daily changing the content that you were viewing and trying to understand whether it affected you. I understand from their perspective why they thought this was effective, but it was extremely unethical. And I think the number of people who are aware that that can be done, on Facebook is absurdly low, right? So on the other hand, I think that data can be useful. For example, when we read Inhuman Compatible, Russell talks about having the AI be uncertain about what it is that you want, and then learning from your choices and your preferences what it is that you mean when you say something. And so in that context, data is useful because you're passing data through to an AI so that it doesn't lock onto any set, perhaps erroneous, of values that it thinks you have, and then does things that you would not approve of. So I think really it's about figuring out what uses we approve of and which we don't, and studying the methods, right, of translating decisions from data extensively and their implications.
So we had about 1,000 more interesting questions, but don't want to hog the speakers all to ourselves. So I think we can have some final closing thoughts at the very end, but I think now I'd like to bring in a little bit of audience participation. So please feel free to use the raise hand function, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question in person. If you don't want to speak, you can just pop it in the chat, and we'll go through those. But I see that Kim Martin has popped 2 questions in. Kim, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your questions. If you don't, I will, but please go ahead if you're there. And the questions can be directed at anyone in particular, or just generally. But okay, then in that case, I'm going to ask.
It's very noisy.
Okay, cool. I'm going to ask Kim's second question here, which I'm super interested in, which is if any of you have any thoughts on the prospects of well-applied artificial intelligence enabling some sort of new socioeconomic system that could successfully outcompete contemporary capitalism. So maybe trying to have a bit of a good news story. I talk a bit about some of the hopes. A couple of people, after saying some quite depressing things, have said things like, but I am hopeful. So maybe people can elaborate a little bit on what those hopes might be. Pelonomi, I don't know if you want to kick it off, or anyone can.
Yeah, because I feel responsible for bringing down the mood. A book I would recommend is a book called Data Feminism. And the reason why I recommend this book, it does talk about a whole lot of the bad stuff, but it also has a lot of really great examples of how data is being used for good. And yeah, I can't think of one of those very particular examples right now, but something that did trigger some of that stuff is what Arnu was talking about earlier when he mentioned that Google has a specific center that is looking at flooding. Some of the interesting work within that social arena or social space that is happening around the world is with regards to like looking at poverty. I had a friend in South Africa who did a study trying to understand the implications of spatial apartheid in South Africa and how it has continued on from the historical situation in order to try and address things recently. And I mean, in my space, I use machine learning to help catch fraudsters, which I think is a positive thing, to save your money and things like that. Yeah, maybe it's the cool, but I mean, there is a lot of positive application areas for machine learning. So yeah, I'm sorry for that my mind is not quite in that space.
Maybe I also just want to add, there's Pelonomi also has a great talk, if you guys don't know, from Indaba X on like ethics and bias and machine learning. And there's this part where you talk about the incentives of caring about this, and it's nicely broken down that even if you're just egocentric, like you should care about this. And I feel like you can do the same with many things in, like, if you look at inequality, for example, there's good research on not only does inequality, is it really bad for the people who are on the lower side of things, but it's bad for everyone. And like, if you're in a real unequal country, it affects like across the board people, like your mental health, all these things. And so even if you're at the upper side of your environment you're in, there's still incentive to work on these problems. And I think as more and more sort of research are showcasing these type of things, I think there'll be incentives aligned to try and solve these problems, and hopefully, you know, whether it's bias or inequality, or there will be this recognition of, even if I'm just caring about myself, I don't really care about, you know, what's happening, you know, somewhere else. There's enough research to convince me that I should be working on this, and hopefully that sort of drives good uses of AI, and keeps things aligned. And I would say across the board, there are maybe more examples than like just bias or just inequality that affect everyone, and you're not like necessarily aware of this. But as these things come to light, it's just I mean, if everyone in the room is happy, it's easy to be happy. If half the room's not happy, maybe it's not so easy to be happy. So yeah, just makes sense.
Great. So another question was from Sinjin, who asks, well, first of all, Sinjin recommends Edward Snowden's book on what Tommie was talking about in terms of your data being important. So go read that. Sinjin's question was, how important is open source research for AI safety? And in particular, he's relating that to OpenAI's move to the capped profit model. So maybe Tyna, you could say something about that.
Maybe speak a little bit generally just about AI as a company. I mean, OpenAI as a company at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think what I understand from the question is that you're curious to understand if the cap profit model relates at all to some sort of openness in general in research and transparency. And I think that's generally true. OpenAI as an organization has, I think, devoted a ton of energy towards publishing its results and its techniques and its methodology. And in the cases where it feels it's appropriate and safe to do so, releasing them, right? I think you had free access to GPT and GPT-2, the CLIP model that was developed and released this year. And so I think that the more minds are working on AI safety, the better. And that has been the approach that the company as a whole takes. There are academic partnerships that we have with people at other institutions. And yeah, there are academic partnerships that we have with people at other institutions, and that includes with developers, with policy researchers, and with policymakers. I wish there was, I think the related question is whether there's an AI academic poaching problem caused by industry. And I don't think, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can answer. But otherwise, I was going to throw that to Tommie, because I think he's at the very
absolutely. No, yeah, I think, yeah, Tommie's way better placed than I am to answer that question. I hope I answered your question adequately. Yeah.
Actually, I see we have 1 minute left. So if you don't mind, can I quickly ask a question to the other three panelists? I know this might be a little unusual, but I was kind of keen to hear what they think about the following issue. And that is the environmental effects of building machine models with big data. So it's similar in a sense. So I had a look at the chat, and someone briefly mentioned blockchain. there's a similar issue with, well, at least with Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, that it is environmentally not a good thing to do. And similarly, there's been a number of research papers when he talks about using building models with large amounts of data, that this is from an environmental perspective, it's a problem. And frequently what's being mentioned is that it seems that, you know, if you do things in a smarter way, it might be possible to use much smaller data sets to achieve the same effect. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort in moving in that direction. So I was just quickly wondering what the other panelists are thinking about this.
Can I give a quick shoot, because I'm really passionate about this. So I'm really glad that you brought this up. A small passion about the environmental side. So I know one of the largest language models in the world currently requires, like, I mean, its carbon emissions are the same as like 5 cars over their entire lifetime, which is a lot of stuff, especially if that's only training it once. And it still has all sorts of bias issues within the data, so that's a big problem. But something that I'm quite passionate about from an African perspective is that point that Tommie mentioned, where currently the approach to machine learning is just to throw more resources at it. And I think that is the approach because it's very much guided by places that have more resources. And so this is the method that they have chosen because it's worked for them up until now. But I think in this way, Africa really is an advantage because we don't have access to so many resources, that we are inspired to think more creatively and come up with different kinds of ways to solve problems. And I'm really, really excited about that. Like Masakane, the language grounds roots movement that is happening on the continent, for example. Just the ways of them conducting research and building research and building research outputs is so exciting for me because it is so different that, to what already exists. And the reason why is because they just don't have the same kinds of data resources and compute resources that these big institutions have. So yeah, I'm really excited. That's something to be optimistic about.
Maybe I can go next because Tyna, I think maybe the OpenAI side here is a bit under fire. Yeah, it feels like, you know, Ilya Sutskever and the main people there at OpenAI really have this like scaling hypothesis in mind, and we just take larger and larger neural networks, and as we scale them, and it's shown like remarkable results, but to some extent, like if you look at some of the work, like Judea Pearl's work on causality and everything, he has this thing called the ladder of causation, and there's association at the bottom, and in the middle is intervention and counterfactual reasoning. And true intelligent systems or humans are sort of the argument is that you really need something like counterfactual reasoning to actually do well and be able to be adaptive and maybe align with the definition of intelligence that I mentioned earlier from Francois. But something like GPT-3 scaling up is still at like the first rung. It's like it's learning a really complicated conditional probability distribution, but that is still all it's doing. Or at least, like, I mean, yeah, there's debates on this, but it is interesting to think like how OpenAI and companies that do believe in the scaling hypothesis feel about if there's clear evidence that there's limitations to the reasoning you can do if you do not have things like causality or things included in the model, like how far you can push the scaling approach, and whether, because each new test, let's say like each new let's try this out, has a massive carbon footprint, like we've been talking about, and environmental consequences and these type of things. And what's also maybe something to consider from a is like with every breakthrough, maybe there's incentive to be followed by others to also try this. And so after GPT-3 came out, there was like, okay, but someone's trying to beat the number of parameters of GPT-3 and also train their model really largely. And now people in China maybe also try and do this, and So yeah, maybe these are just some of the considerations. It'd be interesting to hear what you think, and maybe what the top people at OpenAI, how they feel about these things.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the scaling hypothesis. I think that when it first emerged, it was a surprising result, right? Just make things bigger instead of trying to build in logic, and you will get something that is at least a facsimile of intelligence, right? Still makes many mistakes, but performs some tasks relatively well. With the models being as large as they are first, of course, we're concerned about the carbon footprint. Currently, the models run on Azure, which purchases carbon credits, and is on track with power and data centers 100% on renewable energy by, I think, 2025. But more important than that, there are, even with for parties with the most resources, there are some constraints, right? Pelonomi talked about having to get creative when constraints are placed upon you. I think even with infinite money, there are physical constraints in terms of hardware and resource availability, including chips, et cetera. So it doesn't even seem efficient to just keep pushing the scaling hypothesis. As you've probably heard by now, we're doing more with smaller models, and the techniques developed in that branch of research are likely to benefit AI safety or scaling research, because I think we'll probably or hopefully get insights about how to build small and powerful models, which I think, to Pelonomi's point, should level the playing field a little bit and decrease the incentive for people to expend these huge amounts of resources. Was that, did I answer every question you had, Arnu?
Yeah, that's, and really awesome to hear Azure is has sort of a counterbalancing effect to their compute, and I didn't know that, so that's great. Yeah, but thanks for the answer, Tyna.
Do any of the panelists have any final wrap-up thoughts? Anything that they think is still important to share? Any sort of main takeaways that they want to leave us with? Because we want to start wrapping up right about now.
I can start. I similarly to all the other panelists, I'm really excited about AI research and its potential to do good, change us, and transform us into better societies. I want to emphasize that because I think I have been indexing problems a lot, but that's really my main point, that we should pay attention as we continue to develop these amazing things and get more input from more people and more different and diverse populations if we hope to have technology on a global scale.
Pelonomi, do you have any quick? Thanks.
The first one is a little bit of a joke. In case we have created a little bit of a panic atmosphere, but there's a stat that says something like only 90% of machine learning models don't make it into production. So in the case that we do manage to develop AGI in the next 20 or so years, it'll probably take another 10 in order for it to be scalable to the rest of the world. But on top of that, I think one of the things that is really important or in front of my mind quite often is the idea that collecting more data will solve a lot of problems. And I think this is along the same path as being a little bit more creative about your solutions and your problems. I think that there is so much more work that can be done in order to understand models, to understand people, to understand the problems of the world and how to solve them. If we look a lot more into the data and we try to understand it for what it really is. Sometimes collecting more of it is just collecting more of the same bias. And yeah, I guess that's it for me.
So I can go next quickly. So let me just say that in a sense, I'm kind of disappointed. I expected us to disagree more, but we seem to be in perfect alignment. So I mean, really, it seems to me that from everything that everyone said, we're all kind of pulling in the same direction, so to speak. So that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think I should go last. What a wonderful discussion. I've had a lot of fun, and I could do this for. I wish we had more time, but anyway, we have to end now. Yeah, I think maybe also just on the negative side or positive side of the conversation, I think because there's maybe a disproportionate amount of energy being put into developing AI versus like AI safety, there's a bit to say about being blunt about the risks and maybe being more on the emphasizing that side than saying, hey, everything is going to be hunky-dory, let's just like keep on keeping on. So hopefully everyone listening here can think about that and just know that there are massive plus sides and there's huge opportunities to do great things with AI. But I think because so few people are interested in AI safety or looking at that sometimes the people who are kind of feel like, hey, we need to be a bit like more aggressive with the possible downsides, but so I think just pinch of salt with the discussion, and I think everyone here wouldn't be in AI if they didn't feel like there's some very good things that can come from it. So yeah, that's it from me, and thanks for the organization and everything. Thanks, guys.
No, that was a great wrap up. Thanks very much, and you're right, it's unfortunate that time seems to run so quickly. But this is the kind of thing that Effective Altruism and Effective Altruism UCT is very interested in. So hopefully we can continue to have these very interesting discussions going forward. I'd like to say a big thank you to our 4 panelists. We are really grateful that you guys took the time to do this. There was also a lot of prep that went on before this, and you guys were great about responding and interacting with us. So we are very thankful to all of you. And also thanks to all the participants that joined. It was great to have so many people, and I think Arnu was very right about this being an important issue to drive home the importance of discussing AI safety, and so hopefully that's something that all the participants have been left with. I don't know if you have any final thoughts?
No, the last thing I want to say is just another thank you to all 4 panelists. You were all fantastic. You all had really interesting points, and it really made the discussion very lively. So thank you. And yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, and as a final point just on data and privacy, we're probably going to send all the signups one final thank you email. There'll also be a recording of this event, which will be on the registration website. I think this was super valuable, and hopefully this can live somewhere where people can use it and refer to it. But after that final email, your email will be destroyed and we will completely forget about it. So you don't have to worry about us spamming you forever. But we'll also share probably our LinkedIn page where you can find further events that we're going to be hosting. EAUCT is going strong, and we are really keen to have more of these kinds of events going forward. So yeah, that's it from me. Final thank you to panelists, and thanks to everyone else for coming. Good night, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.